Hey Know Why listeners, before we jump back into our family formation series, which I'm super excited about, I did want to take another break to ask a quick question, which is, why are so many people buying into conspiracy theories? I think it's important to address this topic in this moment because we have been seeing an increase in people believing in conspiracy theories. There are also a significant proportion of Americans who believe that the belief in conspiracy theories is a problem. And I will link an article that references that study in the show notes and talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But we have seen kind of a spike in conspiracy theories again, both on the right and the left end of the political spectrum. And so I've seen this myself on social media. I try to follow a variety of voices so that I don't get caught up in any sort of echo chamber. And I've seen, especially with regard to the Charlie Kirk assassination, a lot of conspiracy theories. And I want to talk about three things specifically: why people are drawn to conspiracy theories, why it's dangerous to have that be your default that you go to, is to believe in the conspiracy theory explanation of an event rather than an actual evidence-based presentation of an event. And we will talk about what evidence actually is later on in the episode. And when you are presented with a conspiracy theory, how to think through it with clarity. Because a lot of times there are actual pundits, not just, random people on the internet, but people with huge platforms who are actually promoting conspiracy theories. And oftentimes they come across very persuasive. It seems like they have evidence. They're an intelligent individual, and they're someone that maybe you've trusted their voice for a long time. So why wouldn't you believe what they have to say? And so it can be very confusing for people. And I want to give some tips and suggestions for how we can think through that. Now, why is this important for Know Why podcast specifically? Well, obviously, it's right there in the name. Our mission is to help young adults and anybody who's listening know why you believe what you believe. And if we really want to examine our own beliefs and make sure that our own beliefs are aligning with reality and aligning with truth and aligning with evidence, then we need to be very careful about how we think. We need to be critical thinkers. And here's the thing. I think most people who do buy into conspiracy theories, they believe that they are thinking critically. And I think sometimes that is the case, but it's really easy to get deceived by these. And so we want to just make sure that the beliefs we hold are true. That's the whole point of the podcast, is to help us be careful in the way we think and really confident in the beliefs that we hold. So that's why I wanted to address this, and I felt like it was a good time to do so just with the current events that have been happening lately. So again, I always welcome your feedback. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you agree, if you disagree, give me your feedback and let's have a conversation about it. But let me just go ahead and dive in. And I will mention again that there is a really good article by Dr. Merrill Mathews. He's actually somebody that I have the opportunity to speak with a lot on Point of View Radio Talk Show as co-host and fellow panelists. And he wrote an article recently on conspiracy theories where he actually talks about, again, how we can evaluate them, and it's helpful. So he has some tips and suggestions that he talks about that are even separate to what I was going to talk about. And it's funny because I was already planning this episode and didn't even realize he was writing that article until I saw over the weekend that he had published that. So it just adds some great additional information that I will link here so you can read more about that if you like. But first, why are people drawn to conspiracy theories? I think the most basic explanation is because people want to make sense of the world. And when there are things happening that are scary or confusing, then I think people are more susceptible to them because they're trying to figure out, why is life happening the way that it's happening? And this is something that we could get really deep into, and I don't really have time for here, but we are seeing a moment in our culture, in our civilization, where really the foundation of worldview, of kind of moral and ethical understanding that served as the foundation for Western civilization and for the United States culture, that's really been pulled out from underneath of us. There is not a consensus on worldview anymore, meaning that there isn't kind of a shared set of values of what right and wrong are anymore in our culture. It's very divided. So there's just not very much consensus. There's not a whole lot that people can fundamentally agree on. And so it does feel like things are a lot more unstable than they were in past generations. Even things like that used to be kind of universally trusted voices or institutions, like certain news channels, or being able to trust the church and your local minister, or being able to trust what the White House says, or what the AP says, or what CBS says, or what 60 Minutes says, or what the school teacher says. People are questioning everything. So they're trying to make sense of the world. There isn't a common consensus of who we can believe and who we can trust. A lot of times it seems like people are living in two totally different realities. People do not understand each other. They think that their political opponent is evil. There are polls and surveys backing up all of this. So it's the time is ripe for people to believe in conspiracy theories and latch on to any explanation that they can. I think to go even deeper into that, people see problems. They see evil in the world. They see people getting shot. They see wars breaking out. They see scandal and people in positions of leadership that prove to be untrustworthy. And they want someone to blame. They want to know, okay, who's responsible for this? All of those, I think, are reasons why people are drawn to conspiracy theories, especially in certain times more than others. Now, here's my counterpoint to that. From a Christian perspective, from a biblical worldview, we already know the answer to those fundamental questions. We already know who the bad guy is. The Bible tells us in the book of Ephesians that our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and authorities and powers of this world's darkness, against the spiritual powers of evil in the heavenly world. So we know that there is a spiritual enemy. We know that God exists from the biblical standpoint. We know that there are spiritual enemies, created beings who are not humans, but are more like angels, okay, that rebelled against God and are constantly fighting against everything good that he's working for. So we know that there is a spiritual battle between good and evil happening. We know that there are, again, that human beings are not perfect. We all deal with the effects of sin. We all make selfish decisions. We do things, for the wrong reasons. We do things to harm other people. And every decision that we make has a ripple effect that affects somebody else, either in a positive way or a negative way. So these are fundamental truths about reality and how it works. So as Christians, we already know this. But if we forget it, or we're not focusing on it, or somebody doesn't have that foundation, then they're even more susceptible to try to find an explanation for why bad things are happening, why the world is scary or confusing and it's not working out the way that they think it should or the way that they expected it to. So I think that's why people are drawn to conspiracy theories. Now, why is it a problem? So there are a few reasons that I think it's problematic for somebody to not occasionally believe into a conspiracy theory or look at something that, is extremely persuasive or has a lot of evidence and change their mind. But that's the default. That is the explanation that we go to, that we hear a conspiracy theory and we're immediately drawn to it rather than skeptical of it. Why is that a problem? Because I think most of the time they're just flat out wrong, and I think it's easily provable that they're wrong, and they don't make sense, but they become so persuasive and people buy into them that they think they've figured it out, but it's distracting them from what the actual truth is. Because once somebody has figured it out, then they're going to be operating according to that understanding, however false or wrong or misguided it may be, rather than the truth. So it will actually lull people into complacency while they are being deceived into thinking that they've figured it out. But with a lot of these conspiracy theories, especially, because the boogeyman of modern conspiracy theories tends to be some group of super powerful people that are behind the scenes, that are kind of pulling the strings and directing the puppet show and making everything work out so that we can never get ahead and never succeed. And it's always this force, whether that's the Illuminati or, unfortunately today, a very anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that's not new, by the way, but that there are evil Jewish people behind everything and that they're really calling the shots. It's always some super powerful group that like normal people can't really do anything against. So you feel like you're doing something by having figured it out and like being in the know, but there's not actually anything you can do against the Illuminati or against whoever you think it is that's doing all these things and that's actually controlling, all the power, all the money. So but you think that you've done enough just by figuring out and talking about it. But what that does is it keeps you from actually facing up to what's really happening in the culture and actually being effective and addressing this. And I think that this is just multiplied, this effect of being lulled into complacency and thinking that you're doing something. It's multiplied for Christians. And so it's especially dangerous for Christians to get sucked into this. And I will just use the example of the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I hate almost on one hand to keep talking about it because it is so sad, and I hate to even give airtime to a lot of these conspiracy theories. But there are real issues and real factors at play in our culture that are very dangerous and very dark, and that need people of God, people of truth, to speak up against. And those are the factors that led to the assassination of Charlie Kirk and have also led to many other problems in our culture. But within what felt like just a second, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people who I think are well-meaning, who were supporters of Charlie Kirk and of what he was trying to do, they got swept up into this conspiracy theory that is completely detracting from the point. So we have a culture that is extremely divided. As I mentioned earlier, you have two sides that tend to view one another as evil. You have a culture that has, especially on the far ideological left, and again, there are surveys that can show that this is more imbalanced toward the left than the right, this way of thinking, that political opponents are irredeemable, that they are the ultimate evil, that words are violence, and the only way to respond to harmful and hateful words is through violence, that's actually excused. You have a group of people that have called their political opponents Nazis and fascists and talked about how this is the end of democracy and really created these very, very high stakes, at the same time saying that words are violence and, we can respond with violence, and excusing the violence of things like, riots and everything in recent years. And so it breeds a lot of political violence. Now, of course, there's political violence that happens on the right as well. But there's a very specific ideology that is at play here when it comes to trying to silence somebody saying something that you deem hateful or offensive with violence, and then thinking that that's justified, or that it is justified to commit violence against people who you believe are doing so much harm. So you have that, but you also have a lot of mental illness. You have a lot of isolation. You have a loneliness epidemic. You have a purposelessness epidemic among young men, which we've talked about on this podcast before. And so we've also seen a lot of problems with how easy it is on the right and the left for people to become, especially young men who are lonely and isolated, maybe they're already struggling with some mental health issues, to be radicalized online to the point where they commit violence. And this has happened, again, with young men who lean right and young men who lean to the left. So this is a pattern, and not like a connecting the dots and, I think this is a pattern kind of thing, but like an actual verifiable pattern where young men are committing these acts of violence because they've been radicalized online and they have been isolated from any sort of real community. And oftentimes they have been struggling with mental health issues or other things. And they have been sucked into a world where they are convinced that they need to go and, kill someone or commit a mass shooting. And often this follows, written confessionals, manifestos. Like this is a pattern. This is what we're seeing. This is a problem. It is a crisis for young men in our nation. And so we need to talk about why our politics are so divided and how to resolve that. And a lot of people on both the right and the left have been interested in having that conversation. We need to talk about how the dangers of spending too much time online and how young men can easily be radicalized. And the algorithms, by the way, don't help that. We've talked about this on the Know Why podcast too. And if you doubt this, go watch the documentary, The Social Dilemma on Netflix. But the algorithms, the way that it works on things like YouTube and, Instagram, TikTok, and other places, even, darker social media outlets, they draw people in to extremes. They want to suck people in so that they become addicted and they want to keep staying online and they want to keep reading. And so that is how, vulnerable people who are often young and disconnected from the real world or a healthy community, they get drawn into these very extreme ideologies. So these are all real issues that are urgent and they need to be addressed. And these are things that Christians are equipped to talk about because of the truth that we have from God's word, knowing how we are created, how we need community, how we need to have grace and compassion for one another, how we need to love our enemies and forgive, how we don't fight with violence. Like these are all biblical values and perspectives that we can bring to the culture and we need to be talking about in this moment, not distracted by conspiracy theories that say the people at Turning Point USA or some, super powerful donors who didn't like certain things that Charlie Kirk was saying are behind his assassination. If you are a Christian and you are buying into some sort of conspiracy theory about Charlie Kirk's assassination, then I think you are being distracted by the enemy from having the opportunity to speak out about the real issues in the culture, and you are not being effective. And I believe that you are also missing out on an opportunity to see what God is doing, because the Bible says that what the enemy planned for evil, God uses for good. So we have seen that. We have seen something that is evil, that is horrible, that we wish hadn't happened, but God is still using it for good because so many people, as I talked about last week, have been motivated and inspired to get drawn to church. So last week I was kind of talking about how Christians who didn't necessarily like Charlie Kirk or they had problems with him, they can get too nitpicky and too arrogant. And then they miss the fact that people are coming to church and people are seeking truth and they start fighting amongst themselves. Well, if you are also so caught up in conspiracy theories that you are, as a Christian, distracted from the real cultural issues at play that led to this event, then in the same way, you're going to be distracted from actually being effective and speaking out and speaking the truth that we need at this time, that actually has the potential to keep that same kind of thing from happening again. Another reason why I believe it's unchristian to easily buy into conspiracy theories is because it causes you to make assumptions about people and their motives without any evidence. So as Christians, we do want to be gracious in the way that we think. Now you're probably going to say, okay, the Bible says to be innocent as doves and yet wise as serpents. So yes, we do want to be wise, but automatically thinking the worst about everybody that we disagree with or that we don't know or everybody that's in power isn't wise. That's not wisdom, that's bias, because you're not evaluating each thing on its own merit. You're just saying, oh, you belong to this class? Well, here's what I think about you. So what happens with conspiracy theories is there isn't actually evidence. What somebody will do is say, okay, person X was killed and we're trying to find the person who did it. So, I happen to know that they were fighting with their best friend recently. They had an argument. Well, is that a potential motive? Maybe. But if you want to talk about statistically, most people who have an argument with their best friend, it doesn't end in a murder. For some people it might, but most people it doesn't. And if you want to look at a track record, for instance, these people have been best friends for years. They've always been supportive of each other. But then, one argument and then somebody gets murdered. And now you think, well, there's a potential motive there. Therefore, they must have done it. I think they did it. and then you start talking about that, that's slander. That is making an assumption about somebody that is believing the worst about them when you don't actually have any evidence and you probably don't have all of the facts about what actually happened. How unfair would that be? And how would you actually do that to somebody that you knew? If something tragic happened to somebody's loved one, would you go and say, well, I heard that you guys disagreed about something. Were you the one that killed them? How crazy and hurtful would that be? People do that with public figures, though, all the time when there's not evidence for it. We want to have, for some reason, we want to have this like sordid story and some soap opera kind of dynamic when it just doesn't make sense. So conspiracy theories cause people to look for potential motives or things that are a coincidence and draw conclusions. So you look at a few things like, oh, a potential motive, or that's ironic, or that's kind of a coincidence. Now let me fabricate a story out of that pits all these people that I don't know and I don't have evidence for in the worst light possible. The Bible says that love hopes for the best and believes the best about others. Now that doesn't mean that we have to be ignorant or put our heads in the sand or put blinders on when we are confronted with evidence that somebody has sinned or does something wrong. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't call that out when it happens. We are called to be truthful as well and to expose works of darkness. But there's a big difference between seeing evidence or, for instance, in the case of like abuse in a church, believing the account of, multiple victims who say that they have been abused and believing what they have to say and holding the person in power accountable versus with no evidence, just choosing to believe the worst about somebody because you've made up a story in your mind to kind of fit a couple of clues, and then you're going to go with that as the truth. That's just not a biblical or charitable way to think about people. And while you think that you're thinking critically when you're doing that, you're actually jumping to conclusions. That's not what thinking critically is. Falling into conspiracy theories, it causes us to make these negative assumptions about people without evidence. It trains us to believe the worst instead of believing the best. It trains us to be overly cynical of the world instead of being hopeful. And it keeps us, again, ineffective and distracted from the real issues because we spend all of our time and energy either trying to figure out some fabricated story and believing that instead of believing the truth and actually speaking on that. So for people who think that they are making a difference by talking about some conspiracy theory that they've been kind of caught up in, what they're actually doing is evangelizing for that conspiracy theory rather than for the truth or for the gospel. So all this energy that you spend trying to convince other people of some boogeyman that's actually behind something that everybody's covering up, then that doesn't have evidence, by the way, and I am going to talk about evidence in a minute, and spending all your energy on that is keeping you from spending energy on what we already know. Again, that there are powers of evil in the world, in the spiritual realm, that the enemy does want to keep us from being effective. He wants us to be divided. He wants to keep young men isolated. He wants people to be hateful. He wants people to be confused by mental illness. All of these things. He doesn't want us to have healing. He doesn't want us to have hope. He doesn't want people to, forgive one another and learn to love one another instead of being hateful. So we already have an enemy. We already know who it is. We already have our marching orders from the Bible to combat the hate and the lies and to speak truth into our culture when it's needed. So when you are getting caught up in a conspiracy theory, you're being kept from doing that very important work. And so I just think it's sad that people who claim to be Christians, and I have no reason to doubt their profession, are spending time and using platforms to do this, because think about how they could be using that platform to point people to the gospel, but they're using it to just peddle their own conspiracy theories about whoever they think the bad guy is in the situation and distracting from the actual problems in our culture that have led to tragedies like these. So how do we, when we are presented with a conspiracy theory claim, how do we think about that with clarity? Realize, first of all, that when it comes to a true conspiracy theory, there is almost never actual evidence. If you want to talk about evidence, it has to pass the test of beyond a reasonable doubt. According to the dictionary, dictionary.com, the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. So again, facts are things that we actually know that have been proven. If you want to look at Merriam-Webster, then evidence means something that furnishes proof. If you want to look at the origins of the word evidence, it comes from Latin evidentia, which means obvious to the mind or eye. So what people often call evidence, if they say just look at the evidence or look at the facts, and when you look at the things they're pointing to, it's more like clues or potential motives or coincidences that people have strung together to kind of build this narrative or this story of what likely happened or what they think happened, but they're not actually facts or evidence. If it was facts or evidence, then it wouldn't actually be a conspiracy theory anymore. It would just be what we know happened. Just realize that when somebody is talking about a conspiracy theory, what they claim is evidence usually isn't actually evidence. Another thing to think about, conspiracy theories will almost always confirm a pre-existing bias. So let's just talk about Candace Owens. She's been saying a lot of anti-Semitic stuff for a long time, unfortunately. So it's no surprise or big reveal that she's blaming the very people that she has been talking about in hateful terms for a long time. And she's blaming them for this latest thing that has happened. It's like, well, of course, she's going to blame the people that she already doesn't like. And I'm just using that as a example because it's one that I keep seeing pop up a lot. But even with us, if you think about any conspiracy theory that you've bought into in the past or that you are more likely to believe, then it is usually something that already kind of confirms your own perspective. Now, if somebody was to look at something completely objectively, and it's really hard for us as human beings to be objective, even when we think we're being objective, it's really hard. And they actually look at a body of evidence and facts, not just clues or coincidences or, again, theories, like it's called a theory for a reason because it's a theory, it's not proven. And they look at all of that and then they come to a conclusion that's actually different or opposed to their own preconceived notions or what they would have thought or expected. I'm a lot more likely to look at that as being kind of valid and legitimate and worth considering because there was enough there to convince somebody who wasn't already inclined to come to that conclusion. But if somebody is already inclined to come to a certain conclusion and then they take any certain current event and they decide to blame the people that they already don't like or that they always blame for things, that's not convincing. It's just confirming the bias that they already had. And if you think that, then you need to be aware of confirmation bias and realize that you are more likely to believe things, whether that's news stories or explanations for events that already fit into your worldview. And so we have to be really careful that whenever we are looking at an event that we are trying to evaluate actual facts and actual pieces of evidence with as much fairness and objectivity as possible if we actually care about the truth, not just confirming what we already think. If there is actual evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, things that if you want to, again, go back to the Latin, that are obvious to the eye or the mind because they have been presented and laid out as facts, indisputable, and there has been a fair and objective investigation, it's no longer a conspiracy theory. And then people who deny the actual evidence and the facts, they're now guilty of a cover-up. So cover-ups do happen. Conspiracies do happen, but they are often exposed through investigation by the laying out of actual collected facts and pieces of evidence. The fact that this thing happened is no longer a theory. It is something that we actually know, and people who want to deny it or are trying to keep people from seeing the facts, they're guilty of a cover-up, but it's not a conspiracy theory anymore if you actually have the facts and the evidence to show that it happened in the way that you're arguing for it. Realize that what you believe matters a lot. Who you listen to matters a lot. That's forming your mind and forming your thoughts. So if you're listening to somebody who's constantly peddling conspiracy theories, probably not a good influence. And they're probably not as critical of a thinker or as intelligent as maybe they seem. What you choose to speak out on and act on really matters. Our words are powerful. The power of life and death is in the tongue. That's also something the Bible says. And even if you're not a Christian, I don't think anybody can say that words aren't powerful. They are. They're so powerful that you have a group of people in our current culture who believe that words actually justify violence. Now, I don't believe that, also because of what the Bible teaches, but we all can agree that speaking out matters. So when we are thinking about what we choose to give our energy to in terms of our mental energy, what we choose to speak out about, then we really do need to be careful and make sure that we're speaking truth. And if we're going to be sharing something or trying to convince people of something, shouldn't it be what we know to be true? And especially, again, for Christians, shouldn't it be the reality that we already know about the world, who the enemy actually is, and how people can actually find freedom, and how we can actually be effective in making the world a better place? If you get down to it, if you really drill down, the motivation of people who either peddle conspiracy theories or kind of default to buying into them, there's really a motivation to feel superior in a way, because it makes you feel like when there's so little control that you have in the world and everything is chaotic and going the way that you don't like, and you see the problems and it feels like you don't have control, believing in that you are one of the few people who know what's really going on gives you a sense of control and power. It makes you feel like you're kind of in the know and you're better than other people. And there's some sort of comfort in that deep inside. And it kind of, even without us, I think, realizing it consciously, again, it can lull people into kind of a complacency, because you feel like you've already done the work. You feel like, well, I figured it out. I know the truth. I'm more, critical, a critical thinker than you are. But there's not really anything you can do to make it better. As humans, we're actually called to make the world a better place. And so it can be hard, a lot harder, to realize that we're not in control, that there are forces that are, beyond our control for real, not just like some shadowy rich people, but like actual spiritual forces. And then we also have a responsibility, even though we're not in control, we actually have a responsibility to do something about it. We have a responsibility as Christians to fight that spiritual battle, to put on the armor of God, to go out and evangelize, to share the truth, to share the hope that we have, even in the midst of trials, and to speak up when it's not politically correct, or when it's not popular, or when it's difficult, and when people don't like us. Those things are actually a lot harder to do, but that's what we're called to do. Again, we need to be careful what we're spending our energy on thinking about and believing, and then talking about, and where our actions are, because we actually can, we may not be the ones ultimately in control, but we can make a difference. And we'll be distracted from the difference we can make if we keep believing lies about the nature of reality and what's really going on. So I'll leave it there. Again, I welcome what you have to say. If you think I'm completely wrong on this, or I've misjudged anyone, then feel free to let me know. But I just encourage you to actually think deeply and critically about what you believe, and try to be as objective as possible when you are looking at evidence. Be aware of your own bias and what you want to believe, so that when you are reading something that seems to confirm where you already lean, just be aware of that. And then take that with a grain of salt as well. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily like, oh, because I want it to be true, it's not true. But realize that we're going to be more likely to believe a lot of things that aren't true if they already align with our preconceived notions. Anyways, that's it for today. Let me know what you think. Check out the article below for more information on conspiracy theories, including actual actual theories and cover-ups that have happened in the past in our nation and what those looked like. And I'll see you next week on the